Hello, and welcome back to the Create Me Free podcast. This is episode 11, I believe, of the podcast. I am Catherine Versillo. I am a writer, artist, researcher who is exploring the complicated ways in which our health and our circumstances impact our creativity. I have, over the years, created a framework that I call Creative Health Cartography, which maps how that happens, how health is impacted in 6 different areas. So, health impacts creative process, a medium, content, productivity, identity, and business or sustainability. I have presented this in a number of different ways. If you are with me right now, you are probably viewing this podcast or listening to this podcast on the createmefree.substack.com. I have a variety of different platforms, but that's the one where I'm at the most. I have written a workbook, the Creative Health Cartography Workbook, that works through all of these different channels to kind of help other people go through a self-guided way of looking at how health impacts creativity in those different areas. And I work with people one-on-one. I offer a mapping service. You can learn more about that either on the Substack or on createmefree.com. So thank you for being here. I am continuing to work through, so our first season is working through the 6 sections through the lens of the workbook. And we are working on section 2, creative medium. So how does health impact creative medium? We've been working on this for a few different podcast episodes now. Last week, we talked about the different mechanisms by which this happens. So how does it actually occur that health impacts medium? So for example, we talked about how health can change. For example, you have a health something shifts in your health and the duration of time during which you're able to create your work changes. So let's say you have fatigue or you have something mental fog, something that allows you to maybe only work for an hour at a time or a few minutes at a time, whatever it might be, that might change the medium you work in as a result. So perhaps you might go from oil painting to watercolors, or you might switch from painting to quilting or some other change in your medium as a direct result of the change that your health has made to the way that you work. So these 6 areas overlap a little bit. So you'll see, for example, with that, the health impacted your creative process, your duration, but that itself in turn impacts the medium you create in at times. This is just one example. So that episode, the previous episode, we looked at all those different mechanisms. I actually said at the end of that episode, I got a little distracted at the end of that episode, and I said that this episode would be lighter in theory, and that is actually not true. This episode is another theory episode. So I kind of nerd out about all of this stuff. I like to look at the theories and the art history and the nerdy stuff behind all of this. But I have different types of episodes. So in some of them, I'm working through the workbook materials myself so that you can get a sense of what it means to work on this stuff. Sometimes I'm just talking about my own experiences. So there's different ways that I approach this, but we are going to have another theory and art history episode today. So if that's not your jam, you might want to come back next week or look at one of the older episodes. But if you're into that, like I am, nerding out, then that's what we're going to do. So there's basically going to be 3 things we're going to go through in this episode. We are going to look a little bit closer at the concept of misfitting, which we did talk about in last week's episode. And we're going to look at what the research actually says about what specific materials do to your nervous system. We're going to look at a different framework called the Expressive Therapies Continuum. And then we're going to look at some artists. So one of them is going to be an artist we started to look at the end of last week's episode, William Utermohlen. We're going to go into more detail about that work, which I find super interesting, and I'm still really just beginning to learn about it. And then we're going to talk about Chuck Close. He's a really good example of medium changes too. So, and then at the very end, I think I'm going to go through one part of the workbook so that we can bring it back to the workbook a little bit. But okay, so let's go to misfitting. Rosemary Garland Thompson is the theorist that introduced the idea of misfitting. She distinguishes between fitting and misfitting as two different modes of the body-world relationship. So you're fitting when the body and the environment are designed for each other, or at least have adapted to each other. And essentially moving through the world feels unremarkable. Moving through the world, you move through the world in the way that it seems like you should because it's relatively easeful. Um, that's fitting. Misfitting is when those things are not aligned. When the body encounters an environment, material, system, set of expectations that was designed for a different body or mind. So anything that we experience that makes the world harder to navigate is a misfit. So if we live in a world where there's a bunch of stairs, this is the favorite example, and we can't navigate stairs because we have a mobility issue, there's a misfit between us and the environment. There is nothing wrong with us. And there may not be anything wrong with the environment, but there's a misfit. So the important insight here is that fitting, it's always a design outcome. It is not a natural state. It is not you're not normal because there's a fit. Um, that this is a disability studies concept, so it's hard to get away from that language, but it's a design outcome. It's not a natural state of being. The world that feels fitted to you was designed either intentionally or by default to accommodate your body type, your sensory range, your cognitive style, your stamina, your mobility. There's a fit. But when that design does not match your body, the misfit is the result of the design. It's not your body's deficiency. And I just think this is really important because a lot of times as creatives, we look at the limitations or we feel like there's something wrong with us because we can't create in the way that works well in the society, whatever that means, whether that means earning money through our creativity or presenting it a certain way or creating it a certain way. We can feel like something's wrong with us, and that's not the case. There's just a misfit, right? Applied to medium, every medium was developed in a context of particular bodies and particular conditions. The upright easel is a great example. It was designed for a painter who is standing and who can stand for a specific amount of time. The piano keyboard, if you have really small hands rather than average width hands, a span of hands, your experience of playing a keyboard is going to be different. Your hands, the piano keyboard was designed for like the average hand width and span. The traditional printing press requires a certain upper body strength and sustained physical relationship with the press bed. All of these things were designed a certain way for certain bodies. And we can talk about all of the justice and injustice around that in disability studies, but as it relates to medium, we find that sometimes we can't create in the medium in the way that it was designed because of the materials being a misfit with our health, our body or our mind, or both. When health changes a body's relationship with these designed objects, the misfit is between the body and the design, not between the body and the activity itself. You can still create. So it can feel hopeless sometimes that you can't create the way you thought it was intended to be created or the way you used to create. But it's not a misfit between the body and the activity. It's the body and the design of the activity. This concept of fitting, which is the counterpart to misfitting, is fitting. And this happens after renegotiation. When a body and a world have been brought into a relationship that works through accommodation, adaptation, or redesign. Now, this is not the original. It's not your body works in the way it was originally designed, right? It's a new configuration of the body and the material that works for the body now in its current state. The sculptor's drawings. Oh, we talked about Matisse last time, his cutouts. A couple of episodes ago, I went through a medium biography with you, and I talked about the comfort medium. The comfort medium is the medium that you always return to, and it might not be your primary creative medium, but it's one that's really accessible to you. So for me, crochet is really accessible. I can pick it up, I can put it down, it can work through different levels of health and energy. It's not challenging for me to work on crochet as compared to writing, for example. The comfort medium is one that we can often return to when there's a misfit with other things to bring us back to ourselves creatively. So I want to think about fitting as a goal that's different from normal. The goal is not, there's a normal way of working creatively and you try to fit into it. That's not what it is. The goal is a working relationship with your medium, and that fits the body and the mind that you have now. Not the one you wish you had, not the one the medium might have been designed for with the materials originally designed, not even the body you used to have. It's negotiating with the materials that you currently are working with, the medium you are or want to work in, with the body that you actually have. Let's talk about Frank Wilson. He's a neurologist. In 1998, he wrote a book called The Hand. The Hand, and the subtitle is How Its Use Shapes the Brain, Language, and Human Culture. This book is one of the most thorough accounts of what the hand actually is as a cognitive organ. Central argument of Frank Wilson's book is that the hand is not a passive instrument of the brain's instructions. The hand is a thinking organ in its own right. Such an interesting concept. The hand itself is a thinking organ. The intelligence that lives in the hands, the knowledge of how a material behaves under specific pressures and movements, how much force a grip needs to apply, what the resistance of a particular surface is, what it tells you about how to make the next move. This isn't just a conceptual knowledge that your brain has and sends to your hand. It is embodied knowledge in your hand that has been built through practice. So it can't be fully translated just through the brain like that. We looked at Damasio's somatic markers in a different episode earlier, and I wanted to mention that Wilson is a little different from this. So Damasio has the somatic marker hypothesis, which describes how the body generates emotional and evaluative signals that inform decision making. So this is like the gut feeling, the physical sense. Wilson is describing something really specific to the hand. So it's not the whole body. He's talking about the hand, although we can apply this to other things, but as makers, we often use our hands, right? So we're talking about the hand and the intelligence that lives in the accumulated practice of making, in the muscle memory and proprioceptive knowledge that builds across years of working in a medium. You've worked in it for so long, your hand knows what to do. When I did a lot of research into crochet, there was a period of time where I was learning a lot about really a lot older people who crochet and how it helped them practice therapy. And a lot of stories came about where people had lost eyesight, completely gone blind, or lost eyesight somewhat, usually due to aging and macular degeneration, and they could still crochet. They could crochet because they could feel it. Their body knew how to do it. There was muscle memory. The hand knew. What does this mean for health and medium? When health changes the hand's physical relationship with a material, the hand might change, but the intelligence that lives in the hand doesn't change, it doesn't just go away. It relocates. That knowledge is still there in your body somewhere. It often finds other channels. It transfers in unexpected ways to new materials, to new methods. Last episode, we talked about crocheting in the dark or needlework in the dark. It's the same thing as with blind. The hand knows. The hand's knowledge is more durable than the specific physical capacity that health sometimes takes. So yes, if your hand gets damaged, your medium is likely going to change. However, it doesn't mean that you're starting from scratch necessarily, because that knowledge is somewhere, and it's possible to explore different ways of how it might present itself. So that's Frank Wilson. Jean Ayres was an occupational therapist and neuroscience who developed sensory integration theory in the 1960s and 1970s. In 1979, published her foundational text, The Sensory Integration of the Child. I have not read this. I've read about this, and it proposed that the nervous system processes sensory information from the environment in order to enable appropriate motor and behavioral responses. When the processing is efficient, the body can engage with its environment fluidly. When sensory integration is disrupted, the body may be overwhelmed by certain inputs, under-responsive to other inputs, or disorganized. in its responses. So she was working primarily with children who had developmental challenges, but the framework her work established is relevant beyond just that context. What she really described is a nervous system that is continuously processing, and the sensory process properties of whatever it is in contact with, it's processing those all the time, organizing the information, generating responses, and every material that an artist works with is engaging in this system. So that's where it ties into medium. Different materials engage different sensory systems with different intensities. I'll say that one more time. Different materials engage different sensory systems with different intensities. So you might have a wet media. Watercolor is wet, clay is wet usually. This provides strong tactile and proprioceptive input. Dry media, think of graphite, think of charcoal, provides different tactile information. So wet, dry, it's more than just that. It's more surface friction, obviously less fluid, less flowing. Resistive media, like heavy clay or block printing, requires sustained proprioceptive engagement, which is the joint and muscle sense. There's also repetitive media, knitting, crocheting, super repetitive, weaving. This provides rhythmic input, and the nervous system can use that for regulation in ways that you can't use non-repetitive media. So I'm often talking about how the rhythmic flow is healing, and that is related. It's related to this nervous system experience, the sensory experience. None of these are the same experience, and none of these are interchangeable with one another. For artists whose nervous systems have been changed by health, whether through chronic illness, the effects of medication, response to trauma, or any other condition, the specific sensory properties of a medium matter in ways that may not have mattered before that. What a material is doing to the nervous system during the making is a real and documentable question with real bearing on what medium is available and useful at any given time. So one way of thinking about this that comes to mind is like the material of metal. Let's say you have a traumatic experience. Let's say you have a car accident. You used to work in metal and glass. Understandably, the trauma of the car accident activates your nervous system. You cannot work in that medium anymore, or at least for a time. You switch to working in fabric, for example. This is just one example. Sometimes it's not as straightforward as that, but essentially your nervous system requires something different of you because of your health requires something different of you because your nervous system needs something different. The art therapy field has developed this whole concept further into a framework called the expressive therapies continuum, as developed in the 1970s. Also, it keeps being refined, and it organizes creative media along a continuum from kinesthetic engagement, the physical movement of making, through sensory, perceptual, affective, cognitive, and creative levels. There's a framework with these different levels. It proposes that different materials and different ways of working with the same material tend to engage different processing levels, and that where a person is on the continuum on a given day, what their nervous system can access shape what medium serves them. So you're at one of these different levels, the kinesthetic, the physical making, or the cognitive, the thinking. Where you are differs from day to day, and that impacts what medium you can use or how you might use that medium. Hopefully that makes sense. Makes a lot of sense to me, but also feels really dense as I'm trying to explain it. But essentially, we create in different ways from different parts of our senses and our brain and our bodies, and our nervous system changes what we can access at different times. Our health changes that, and that changes the medium that we can comfortably use. It's a complex framework. I'm not trained in it. I don't know it fully. What I do know of it is it's essentially this idea that the maker's nervous system state on any given day has a medium that matches that state. The mismatch between state and medium is one of the most unacknowledged, most common sources of the feeling that the work is not working. Sometimes this is an aesthetic problem, but often it is a nervous system problem. I have an exercise in the workbook. I'll bring it up again a little bit later, but it's called the accessibility audit, and it's literally a way of looking at accessing or auditing what's accessible to you. So it may feel like you cannot work, and that can be frustrating. But it might be that you can only work in a certain medium or with your medium in a certain way, not that you can't work at all. The research on this has grown significantly. One of the things we know now is that tactile engagement with materials activates the somatosensory cortex and often generates a calming effect on the sympathetic nervous system. So repetitive motor patterns, again, crochet, but knitting, printmaking is a good one. These activate the basal ganglia in ways that are associated with reduced anxiety, increased sense of agency. That repetitive motor patterns has that effect on us. Sometimes we need that. Messy, wet, open-ended materials tend to produce more emotional activation than controlled, dry, precise materials. So material choice is a clinical variable that art therapists will use. What medium, what material makes sense for what needs to happen in the therapeutic work. It's different. No material is better or worse than any other, but they have different sensory properties. The sensory properties of what you are making with are doing things to your nervous system. And so understanding that can make a huge difference in what you create, how you feel about what you create, the choices that you make around it. So if you're feeling like you're having difficulty in your creativity that is related in some way to your materials and you're not sure what that's about, tying it together with your nervous system and what different types of materials do to your body could be a way of accessing better understanding about that. Okay. Chuck Close. We're going to talk about him as an artist. He was born in 1940 in Monroe, Washington. He developed in the late 1960s and 70s a method of portrait painting that became among the most recognizable in late 20th century American art at that time. If you know his work, it was large-scale, photorealistic, grid-based portraits that were made by dividing a photographic source image into a very precise grid and painting each unit of the grid individually, building the face from thousands of small cells of color and tone. On December 7th, 1988, at the age of 48, he collapsed in a hallway after giving a speech at a museum gala. He had experienced a spinal artery collapse that left him almost completely paralyzed. Over months of rehabilitation, he recovered partial movement in his arms, but remained in a wheelchair permanently with limited control of his hands. He returned to his studio. He continued to paint. He did this with a brush strapped to his wrist. The logistical and physical realities of painting for a wheelchair with a bound brush are different in almost every dimension from painting standing with a handheld brush. The reach is different, the angle is different, the duration of the working sessions is different, the physical precision available is different. It is not, you are still painting, but it is an entirely different experience. What Close found working within these constraints was that the grid-based method he had developed before the collapse turned out to be exactly the method that his post-collapse body could use. Interesting, right? The grid organized the work into discrete units, and each unit could be completed in the range of motion and duration available. The whole was assembled from the parts, each of which could be made separately and completely. He had developed it for conceptual reasons, but 20 years later, it was actually designed for the body he now had, which I just think is really interesting because, he could have come back and not painted at all. He could have completely changed his medium. We've seen how people change from really precise work to much broader strokes. In his case, it turned out that the system he had created actually worked really well for the body he now had. So it's kind of interesting. Also during this period, he began developing new mark-making approaches within the grid unit. So he was still working in grids, but the small cells of his late work are not photorealistic like the ones of his earlier work. Instead, they're built from abstract marks, loops, diamonds, and they aggregate into a face at a distance. But if you look at them when you're up close, they're more abstract. Any idea why this happened? He developed macular degeneration, changes to his eyesight. Excuse me. This affected his central vision, and it contributed to the way he organized the marks. So he relied more on his peripheral vision and the aggregate effect than on the formal logic of the cell and the photographic source. So he's still working in a grid. He's still painting with a brush, but it's strapped to his wrist. And now, because of his eyesight, he's working around the periphery, so he's not working in a photorealistic manner. Some things have changed, some things haven't changed. Really interesting. Um, each health change altered his method. Excuse me. Each alteration of the method produced work with specific formal properties that the previous version of the method did not have. The wheelchair work is different from the standing work. The macular degeneration work is different from the wheelchair work. This is not a progression. It is not a decline. It is a change. It's a series of changes, each forced by his health, each producing something formally specific and irreducible. He has been very clear about this in interviews, so this is not just me deciding this. He has said repeatedly that the stroke gave him the richest period of his career. He does not mean that the stroke was good. No one is saying that you should have a health issue. We just all face different health issues in different circumstances over time. That forces a renegotiation of the method, and from that, there may be constraints. In his case, the constraints of the body produced work he was not going to make any other way, which is super interesting because he was still using that same grid method, but it was entirely different work. I just find that really, really fascinating. We are going to go into one more art history example. And this is the artist William Utermohlen, who I started talking about last episode, who I still have a lot to learn about. I'm still taking notes and just beginning to learn about him. But what we talked about was how, if you remember, he had Alzheimer's disease and they changed the way he made self-portraits. So he had made self-portraits when he was younger, before the Alzheimer's, and they were really, really clear and detailed. And in the last 5 years of his life, he continued to make self-portraits that changed over time because his brain had changed its understanding of spatial relationships, which changed how he portrayed his work so that by the end, his face wasn't even really distinguishable. Um, it was tracked through the lens of neurology to track the disease itself. So returning to him here, because the expressive theories continuum and the sensory integration framework make something visible in that progression. So we talked about the biography before, but this is the kind of how the theory relates to that. So the ETC proposes that the cognitive level of the continuum is where representational visual art tends to operate. Representational visual art, the self-portrait, operates in the cognitive level. So remember, there's these different levels, cognitive, kinesthetic, etc. This is the cognitive. The maker is processing what they observe, constructing a spatial and formal plan, and executing that plan. When the cognitive level of processing is disrupted by disease, such as Alzheimer's in this case, the work tends to move down the continuum toward the perceptual level, then the sensory level. And when we say down, that's not a lesser or negative. It's just the continuum, the way it's been written in their framework. What the maker can access and express becomes less dependent on cognitive construction and more dependent on immediate sensory and affective response. Looking at the self-portraits through this lens, the 1967 portrait is organized at the cognitive and perceptual levels. The spatial relationships are worked out. So cognitive level, it's there. The face holds its position in the field. It's strong at that level. There's a clear plan, a spatial plan to paint the face the way the face appears to the artist. By those last two portraits of his life in 1999 and 2000, you barely see the face, and what remains in the paintings is sensory and affective. It is the immediate impression of a face, the marks the hands could make, the gray field the eye experienced, rather than what the mind knew was there. So the mind, he could possibly know what was there, but he was going with the perceptual and sensory, not what was in the cognitive. The progression from cognitive to sensory in the paintings is the progression of the disease in his brain. His health changed his perception, changed the way he worked with his medium. The Lancet Neurology paper published on these paintings in 2001 described them as a neurological document as much as an artistic one. And that dual status is exactly what that framework illuminates. The paintings are the record of which level of the continuum was available to him on the day he painted each portrait. As the disease advanced, fewer levels were available. And that last portrait is sensory alone. It's not just clinical, it's very artistic. This is just another way of looking at that same thing. Okay. I am going to switch gears a little bit and stop talking so much theory. I'm going to pull up that accessibility audit. So this is the Creative Health Cartography Workbook. If you're with me on Spotify, you can see this, or sorry, on Substack, not Spotify. You can see this workbook on the video there, and you can purchase it on Amazon or as a PDF. Check out createmefree.com or my Substack to find more information. And what I'm going to do is go to one of the exercises. This book has a variety of exercises in each section. The explorations and exercises for the medium section include a sensory recall, a letter written to your lost medium, and what we're going to do today is the accessibility audit. This is practical and potentially uncomfortable. List the physical requirements of your current creative practice, include things like posture, fine motor demands, stamina, cognitive load, sensory requirements, financial costs, space needs, and time requirements. You're going to put that on one side of the paper. On the other side of the paper, list your current physical, cognitive, and financial reality. Where do those two lists align? Where is there friction? For every friction point, write down one modification that would reduce the gap between them. Maybe it's a smaller scale, a different posture, shorter sessions, a different tool, a cheaper or lower cost material, change in the environment. This is about engineering. You're designing a creative practice that fits your actual body instead of forcing your body to fit a practice designed for someone else's. You are understanding where there's a misfit and adapting to fit. I was going to do this on screen, but I'm not sure to be honest, I'm not sure I have the ability right now to do that. I'm feeling pretty tired and my voice is feeling like it's going. That is not necessarily accessible to me at this time. But let's do one example. So one of the requirements right now is I'm doing this podcast. I need to have a quiet space and to do, let's say, a quiet space. To do that, it's not really a health thing, but it is a circumstance thing. And earlier the dogs were barking, which made it really hard. So that was my current reality. And the gap between them was essentially that I need to make an adjustment. I needed to go give them a treat so they would be quiet so I could do this. That's a really simple, it's not a very good example. Trying to think of a different one. What else do I need to do my work? So for collage, I only need a small space where I can lay out my materials, but it would be nice if I had a space where I could keep that and come back to it and layer it on, and I don't have that space. There's a constraint there, and sometimes I don't have the energy to set up the space. So health-wise, duration-wise, I don't have the energy to go take out all of the materials, clear the space on the table, set it all up before I can do the work. If the work was already laid out because I had that ability, that space, then I could jump right into it and it wouldn't be as affected by that energy stuff. But given the current situation, the adaptation is that the adaptation really is that I only do that work when I have the energy, but maybe there's a different adaptation to be made there. I think I am going to close here. It's a little bit of a shorter episode than usual, but I feel like this episode and the last were really, really dense on theory. And even though I nerd out on that, I'm actually not certain that I'm explaining it very well. Feedback would be welcome as I continue working on learning how to convey this all in podcast form. You can come to createmefree.substack.com to see the written form of all of this. And we are going to continue working on Medium for one more week. So next week, again, we will be working on how health impacts Medium. And then we'll move on to the next category, which is how health impacts creative content, or what you create rather than what you create with. I'm Catherine Versillo, and this is the Create Me Free podcast.